The cycle of nature and your stupid plan don't mean a thing. Eris is gone. Eris will no longer talk, no longer laugh, cry, or get angry. This quote is said by Cloud Strife to Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII. It's a powerful scene that rivals emotional cinematic scenes. And that's what we'll be talking about today. The power of storytelling in games. How it's the same and how it's different. Its successes and failures. Welcome to episode 7 of The Limit Breakers.
Welcome back, welcome back all to episode 7 of the Limit Breakers podcast. This is actually the first episode we're recording in the AM. We'll see if that affects our quality, our consistency, our general vivacity in any direct way, but I think it's going to be a good one. What's going on, guys?
Hey, how's it going?
What's up? I can assure you that I do not lack for vivacity in any way.
I can't attest to that, but I'm going to take Steve on his word at that one. How's it going, guys? We are 7 episodes deep. We are actually doing an episode today that we tried to record a little while back that I'll take full blame for the technical difficulties that followed in editing that episode. So we're re-recording it, but I think in a lot of ways we're going to refine what we did before. I think it's going to make for actually a better episode overall. So I'm pretty excited about doing it. But as we usually do, why don't we talk a little bit about what we're playing, some gaming news, and just get everyone caught up. So anyone want to start?
Oh yeah. So doubtless, of course, all of us have been playing Overwatch together, and that's been a blast. We've talked about it at length. I've also continued going back to playing Divinity Original Sin Enhanced Edition. I think I mentioned before I had been throwing that around as an idea to go back to, and I did, and I'm very, very happy that I did. Been a lot of fun. One thing that's actually come up in gaming news related to Divinity Original Sin is there's been a Kickstarter made by Larian Studios for Divinity Original Sin 2. And very pertinent, actually, this episode we're doing, because it does some really fascinating things with narrative, with a classic narrative-driven storyline, and actually opens it up to both cooperative and competitive multiplayer in, very much grounded in this narrative-based storyline. And just some really fascinating things from the video they were showing on their Kickstarter is actually just how you have diverging storylines. Even though you start out as a type of team, you can actually elect, because you're from different histories, each of your characters is different race and class and whatnot, you can actually elect or even forced into diverging storylines, which ultimately end up forcing you to compete with the person you're playing with next to. But really fascinating ideas. And I know they actually showed at one point someone sneaking up while the other guy was in a quest and just basically murdering him from the back of his head. So it's pretty cool. But I think that'll be a really fascinating development.
Justin, what you been up to?
I can't follow it up with anything near as epic as that, but I have been playing Overwatch with you guys. It's been very enjoyable. Obviously, we did the whole episode
playing
on
is
it.
a loose word for you, Justin.
Well, yeah, experiencing would be the appropriate term. I think we got some big news this week, and I think we're going to touch a little bit on that. But as you guys all know, E3 happened, and I'm kind of excited to just talk about like what your favorite highlights were from that.
Yeah, I'll chime in. Just complete little triangle here about Overwatch. I've been primarily playing that myself. I'm still playing Tactics Ogre. Let us cling together for the PSP, but we are coming off of a night in which we played quite a bit of Overwatch together that was very fun. Had some very memorable moments, both good and bad, including a 2 Reinhardt, 3 Bastion, Lucio game or something of the sort that we actually won, which was pretty memorable all around. But yeah, now Justin mentioned E3, and that's something I really did want to talk about just briefly here. But I'm not really the type to follow sort of up to the second gaming news quite as much as some, nor do I necessarily follow these conventions live as they're going on. But a bunch of the things that were announced at E3 did trickle down to me. Handful of them really did get me pretty excited. The 3 that really stood out to me big time are the announcement of the title of the new Legend of Zelda, which is Breath of the Wild, and some real gameplay stuff from it, which looks absolutely incredible. The graphical style, the size of the game, the physics in the game. I mean, it's everything I think the series should be heading towards, and I think it's really going to be great. I think they announced a release date or a release quarter I don't have that offhand, but I know it's not that far off. Then Kojima's next game, which blew my mind because I knew he was partnering with Sony and I knew he had something in the works after PT, but I did not know anything about what it was. I don't think anyone did. But it's a game called Death Stranding, which might have been the most quixotic and intriguing game trailer ever released. It's explains next to nothing about the game whatsoever, but it's so epic, so weird, and so just gorgeous to look at that it has me, I'd buy it tomorrow not knowing anything about the game at all, except I know Justin will appreciate this. Norman Reedus is doing all the motion capture and acting for the game. He's the main character. The actual character's made in his likeness, and he's doing all the acting for it, which is pretty awesome. And then the third thing is this game, Horizon Zero Dawn, which a lot of people are talking about, which the only way to describe is it's an action RPG where you essentially play what looks to be a futuristic caveman, if that makes any sense. It's some type of apocalyptic society where in the future things have somehow gone backwards to almost an ice age where you're not fighting dinosaurs, you're fighting robotic dinosaurs. So it's an epic action RPG where you play this woman huntress who is basically moving through the countryside, having to fight off giant robot dinosaurs. The trailer actually involves her riding a robotic dinosaur into like a robotic T-Rex and shooting it with like this crazy bow. I mean, all reports are that it's like the most epic and insane game ever made. I'm really curious to find out how in the story any of this happened, but just look it up. You won't be disappointed.
It literally reminds me of the absurdity of that Community episode where Troy and Abed are just Troy and Abed shooting lava.
I mean, what's absurd at all about a giant robotic T-Rex shooting lava? I mean, think about it.
Anything else.
But yeah, those three stood out to me. It's really exciting to have things on the horizon, no pun intended. I always do that are actually pretty exciting to look forward to on top of what we're playing now. So any last things we want to mention before we get into?
Yeah, I'll touch on a few more highlights that came out of E3, just some quick things. I mean, I'm surprised you didn't lead with the fact that there's a new South Park game coming out. But there is actually a new South Park game coming out. But anyway, some of the bigger highlights were that there's going to be the Xbox One S, which will be a slimmer, more powerful version of Xbox One coming out later this year. And then they also announced Project Scorpio, which is supposed to basically make your eyes melt out of your head because it's going to have 4K video graphical support. And so I can't imagine what any of the games will look like Halo 6. They did announce the new God of War, and Steve had mentioned in the Dota episode about actually living in reality. We're taking one step with playing video games and playing Dota and playing as the hero in real life. We're taking one step closer to that with PlayStation releasing their new virtual reality system. It's similar to the Oculus, but it's supposed to be a lot cheaper, and curious to see what that's going to look like.
Interesting.
Well, I don't know if I'd call Xbox big news because Xbox sucks, but
I mean, you're destroying our viewership or listenership over here by saying that.
To each his own, to each his own. Now, we're going to get into, I guess, what is the bulk of the episode here, which is storytelling in video games, how video games excel as a medium when it comes to storytelling, what hindrances they have, how they compare to other forms of media, and just in general, how narratives in gaming have really evolved since the birth of the medium to where they are now, where they're really, in some ways, comparable to other art forms. Now, on the last episode, when we tried to record this, I did sort of a long-winded explanation of the narrative history of gaming. I'm not going to do that this time because I feel like it's better just to sort of go over the general progression real quickly and get into our opinions rather than just lecture you about all the dates and stuff. But suffice it to say that at the birth of video games in the 60s and 70s, games had themes and they had settings and they had ideas behind them. In large part, they were based on pre-existing stories or television. And even that you could identify a theme per se, there really was no narrative in the way we understand it now. For the most part, it was Space Invaders or outer space themed game or Wild West themed games. And they didn't actually have any story you followed. You just had an understanding that they were taking place in that setting. When we got up to the 80s, we got a game like Donkey Kong that actually presented the first ever on-screen narrative we ever got. It was the first game where you could actually follow a pseudo-story just based on what was going on screen with the characters. Donkey Kong kidnaps the princess. You have to get through these levels to get her back from Donkey Kong. But, it wasn't exactly Shakespeare, but it was an on-screen narrative.
Bite your tongue.
Yeah, I mean, there are some Donkey Kong fans here, but we move on to the 90s where we start to really get these bigger, more bold, more complete, more epic stories. The ones that come to mind immediately for me being a fan of both are Final Fantasy VII and Ocarina of Time. But there were plenty of other ones. We started to get really mature games that weren't afraid to go into mature content like Doom and Wolfenstein, Mortal Kombat. It really opened up to the point where games were big enough and were technologically capable of holding stories that were more akin to other media forms. And now, here in the present day, I think it's fair to say that you can tell a story that's actually far longer, far more involved, and far more complex in a lot of ways in a game than in movies and TV. So it's kind of crazy, and it has been a relatively long span of time, but video games literally went from Pong to 200-hour, 18 narrative thread, mediums within really, 2 generations. So we want to talk about how narratives in games have affected us, but also what narratives in games are capable of being, what holds them back, what makes them differ, and just everything about storytelling and gaming in general. So why don't we start off talking a little bit first just about what makes games fundamentally different from other media? Because even though I will often vouch for games having as much significance and as much narrative purpose or as much narrative clout as movies and television, I know a lot of people don't really see them that way. So in what ways do you guys think games are fundamentally different in that regard?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of games, Final Fantasy being chief among them, where, there's so many other side quests and things to do in the game that you can actually forget what the main narrative actually is. It's kind of the Robert Kirkman Walking Dead approach, where it's just what happens next. The movie's over, the story's over, but you can still keep going, you can still keep doing things, and just kind of unlocking other things in the world and discovering things that you might not have known were there, things that aren't essential to the actual story in and of itself. And I think that's a big difference. EverQuest, we talked a little bit about that, does the same kind of thing where there's really no beginning, no end. You can just kind of do whatever you want for forever.
I think what is really characteristic of gaming as a storytelling device is just the fact that there's a type of participation, even co-creation in the story from the person who actually plays the game. If we think of someone who's ordinarily telling a story, then the audience is participating in as much as they're listening and enjoying, but they're not really actually creating that story. And in a game, that really is what happens. You have a basic structure that's set up, but you actually have the player making individual choices and shaping that story. And it's, I think in many ways it's a difficult balance to achieve, where you have, if you could imagine an artist just creating a painting, but then allowing anyone who walks by to add to that painting as they so choose, you can imagine it would, for the most part, be disaster. And yet that in a way that's actually what happens in a video game. And the fact that it works period, but it works so well, it's extraordinary.
Yeah, no, there's no question that interactivity between the game and the player is such a absolutely core part of storytelling in video games and what makes the experience of gaming itself fun. But like you said, it also does sort of hold it back in the sense that a really good artist, or, obviously this is all subjective, but in my mind, a really good artist or filmmaker or television maker, writer, whatever you want to call it, whatever example you want to use, doesn't waste any portion of their art or their story or their film. Everything is a certain way for a certain reason, to convey a greater meaning, to suggest something, to tell the story that they're telling. Every frame of film, every brushstroke on a painting. When you're giving the player in the game some freedom to decide where to go or how to look at things, or changing camera angles, or you're allowing them to alter the way in which they see this story unfold, which takes some power away from the creator. It's a really hard balance to strike, to tell a very specific kind of on one rail story, but also give the player the freedom to do whatever they want, because invariably that's going to change the experience for people. And while that freedom can be a lot of fun, it does sort of make the idea of a cohesive, very streamlined storytelling device a lot harder to achieve. But I think also, as you mentioned, this relationship of the player really having a hand in the story unfolding does lead to a feeling I wanted to ask you guys about, which is, to me, a lot of times, and I think this is one of my favorite things about the video game medium, is that my level of involvement in the story and my compulsion to achieve things in the game are a lot of times a lot greater than movies or TV, because I feel like it's almost my responsibility to see that they unfold the way they're supposed to. Like, if I'm playing an action game and I'm supposed to be defeating this evil guy and saving someone, like, you really feel like, oh, I need to play well and achieve this, because if I don't, Princess whoever is going to die, or I have to, I don't want to fall off this ledge here. I need to hang off and parkour my way across this thing, because if I don't, whatever it is, you feel like there's an onus on you to actually see the story unfold the way it was meant to, or to achieve things in the story, because you feel like you are part of it and you feel like that's a necessity.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you literally have a sense of responsibility for the story. And, I mean, sometimes it's a pretty shallow sense that just stems from, just the desire to achieve more. But I would say more frequently, it's actually a deeper sense of leaving something unfinished that needs to be finished, as if you are literally an artist with an unfinished piece of work.
I would give a specific example just because it's the first thing that came to mind. And I remember telling our friend Jeff this as I was playing this game, but when I was playing Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, I literally remember thinking to myself at all parts of the game that, I am supposed to be playing Big Boss right now. I can't suck at this game because Big Boss would not suck in this situation. I can't get killed by this one random soldier behind this tree because Big Boss is, Big Boss. He would not die in this place. He would choke this guy out. He would. So I almost felt like, oh, the responsibility is on me playing this character to live up to a certain standard of performance, which is a ridiculous notion when it's you sitting alone in a room playing a game, but it's a great notion from the standpoint of the way the game's hooking you in, because you actually feel like, oh, wow, I'm part of this tale, and I know this guy's supposed to be legendary, so it's on me to make sure I play in a legendary fashion. You ever experienced something similar, Justin?
Yeah. No, I definitely feel the same way. When I was playing Dead Space, and I don't know, it's just being immersed in that kind of horror genre, and feeling like if I don't actually kill this necromorph, it's gonna literally absorb everyone on the ship, and it's gonna take over the entire world and basically destroy the entire world, as it were. So I definitely feel like being in that situation where there's a lot of peril, and I don't know, you just get caught up in it, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we mentioned in our first ever episode, Justin and I were film majors in college. Not that necessarily denotes anything, overly specific, but what it does do is let you know that we have spent quite some time studying film and television to an extent. And even despite our great passion for film, I don't know that I've ever felt more on the edge of my seat or more really sucked into something in the moment than I have at the zenith of my game playing. There's some movies that I absolutely adore that really have made me emotional, made me, been intense beyond all belief, but there's nothing quite like those boss fights or those real peak climaxes of games where you're legitimately like standing up, sweating, and want nothing more than to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve, that really do just affect you in a way that, for me, other mediums never have. Now, this is a question for Steve. I think a good way to sort of put a cap on this particular subject and move on to the next one is, I know you as much as anyone have been a really big fan of the growing trend of open world games. Now, I think open world gaming is a really important part of the continued development of gaming in general, but do you think that this focus on open world has kind of gotten us away from traditional storytelling in games too much, or do you still think there's room for a really strong story in an open world setting?
The short answer to that last question, is there room for a really strong story in an open world setting, I think is ultimately no. And I don't mean to diminish certain storylines, say within Skyrim, say within The Witcher, which also had some incredible narrative, but I think that at the end of the day, what happens in an open world game is that really the story becomes subordinated to the environment. To the setting itself is so interesting, in a good way. It's so interesting that the primary enjoyment, the primary drive for playing the game becomes a matter really of exploring it, and of of capturing that setting in its pureness. And I think that this what frequently occurs in these games, and I've certainly played a few of them and enjoyed them immensely myself, is that the different storylines you have become a means to really opening up that setting. They become a means to exploring it and experiencing it in its fullness. But at the end of many of these storylines, you're left just kind of sitting in that setting, basking in it. And I think that is, it's I think it's a different use of story, and ultimately it certainly places the value of a story much lower than a traditional narrative based game. That doesn't mean there's not a place for those games. They're still fantastic games, but as far as whether or not their actual stories can be as strong as you would find in an actual narrative based game, I would say not.
No, yeah, I think that's a terrific answer that really kind of encapsulates my own opinion, and I don't think it was ever more apt. I know that Metal Gear Solid's coming up a lot on this particular episode, but in large part that's because I think Kojima is such a specific kind of storyteller. But The Phantom Pain was a really interesting game because the Metal Gear Solid series up till that point had been these very succinct, very specific, very not straightforward in in terms of the way they told the story, but straightforward in the sense that they were short games that were very narrative heavy, very cinematic heavy, and told very beginning to end stories. But The Phantom Pain all of a sudden was this open world game where in the 200 or so hours I think I played that game, probably 185 were just spent wandering the countryside, doing things on my own accord, just for the sake of enjoying the environment and the gameplay so much. And while that didn't diminish the story per se, it absolutely made my major focus in the game just absorbing the entire environment and ambiance of the game, which in and of itself was great, but absolutely did make the storyline sort of secondary to that, which was something I certainly noticed.
I would even take it a step further. So we talked a little bit about storytelling in the sense of a traditional game and an open world. I want to talk about the absence of a storyline can still make a game feel equally as compelling. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about Overwatch. I mean, you were asking me about, you were talking about Big Boss earlier, just a moment ago, and even last night, I was playing Overwatch, and even though it doesn't have a story, I felt like there was a lot at stake. I'm sitting there in my basement, just playing as Bastion, trying to snipe people, trying to avoid getting, killed myself, and I left the game that night, like last night, feeling like wired, like I'm in some sort of combat zone. Like I need to, like everything I'm doing is for my survival, and even though I did get killed numerous times, probably, I felt like immersed in that world, and that was all without a story, really. I mean, you have a generic premise, which is war itself, but I mean that's not necessarily a story. But it's pretty incredible that you can kind of get that feeling just from playing a game.
Yeah, so I think, story or lack thereof can play a lot of different roles, and I think we could almost create a little bit of a spectrum of games, right? You have games that are essentially, or for all intents and purposes, storyless. Then you have games that occupy more of a middle end of the spectrum, like open world games, where you have story as a means to a higher end. And then you have classic RPGs, which story really is the end in itself, and everything is meant to direct you to that end.
Could you really say a lot was at stake, Justin, when you never left our spawn point?
Always.
Okay, just checking in, just making sure. I think a really good way to examine this also is we've talked about how games sort of compare to movies and television and other media and art forms when it comes to telling stories. Let's talk a little bit about actual attempts to translate either games into other mediums or other mediums into games with varying results without question. Now, at first, let's look at some games that have actually been made into movies, which is still a growing trend. Now this is certainly something that studios are still trying to do, but historically we have some pretty interesting examples of game adaptations. So the first one that comes to mind for me that I think sort of set the bar for exactly what was wrong with trying to adapt games into movies for the most part is the Super Mario Brothers movie, where they took this game that is known for being colorful, lighthearted, fun, really easy to play and easy to enjoy for everyone, and made a very dark, dystopian, sort of humorless science fiction film, which, of its own merits isn't a horrible film, but it has absolutely none of the virtues of the game. And if you're going to make a movie that doesn't even really resemble the game at all, why even call it, Super Mario Brothers? It seemed like they wanted to make the movie they wanted to make and just wanted the title to maybe draw in some fans of the game for some extra cash. But it's important to remember that if people are seeing this movie with the understanding that it's a game adaptation, honestly or
Yeah.
obviously,
I mean, they'll be expecting a similar experience
yes.
in the game.
If they weren't, then I don't know what exactly, why exactly that would be. But that sort of set the bar for me in terms of how incorrectly a lot of studios go about making these adaptations. Any more come to mind for you? There's a couple more I've got here, but
Yeah, I've got a ton. Most of them are pretty awful, but well, we have Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, which while it looked aesthetically pleasing and pretty amazing for its time, story kind of just fell flat. And then same thing with kind of Advent Children when they made that into a sequel spin-off of Final Fantasy VII. Also, we had Max Payne, Prince of Persia, Silent Hill. I think probably the best movie series or franchise that's been done is probably Resident Evil, and even that in and of itself still isn't great, but it was compelling enough that they were able to make several sequels out of it, and so enough people were seeing them. And even though like I said, they didn't hear it exactly to the storylines or anything like that, it was still a unique premise and a unique concept based around the time it came out.
I do think Resident Evil is a really good example of perhaps as much as one could and should reasonably expect from a game adaptation, in that you get a similar experience in the movie. You get some interesting quirks in the movie itself. I mean, I'm just thinking, for example, like Mila Jovovich just becomes an icon of the movie that is slightly different from the game, but not conflicting with it. But you get a certain level of popularity and a fan base that doesn't blow the doors off, but is consistent.
yeah, no, I think Resident Evil was a good game or a good series to try to adapt, and they did a decent job in the sense that it's not a game that's so serious or so plot driven that you really need an overly melodramatic or overly grim, depiction. A lot of it is about people wanting to see these monstrous creatures brought to life, people wanting to be scared, people wanting the action aspect, and that's a good idea. I think where games fall flat a lot of times is where they try to turn things that were never that serious and were never that kind of meant to be taken that seriously and try to make these very dramatic productions that don't feel in keeping with the spirit of the game originally. Because a lot of these games, like Super Mario is a good example, I don't think most people play the Super Mario games with any intent of bawling their eyes out or really thinking long and hard about the world. They're fun escape type games, and trying to turn that into something with this actual weird like social, I don't know, relevance was just a very odd decision. We're gonna get some hate for that Advent Children remark, Justin. I know, I don't love Advent Children because I just don't really like all the associated Final Fantasy VII stuff. Final Fantasy VII is my favorite game ever, but I was perfectly fine with the game sort of being the end of the lore in a sense, and yet it's gone on to spawn like a million other games and a million other pieces of fan art and associated material, which is fine. But I know some people do enjoy that. I know at the time you liked it a fair bit, but I get your point exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly visually stunning, and I just kind of felt like, but we didn't really need that story. Like the story didn't really add anything to the world for me. But it was compelling nonetheless to see some 3D summons on the screen.
Yeah, with all that being said, I do think one thing about Advent Children that does pertain to a larger variety of game adaptations is I do think animation works extremely well in game adaptations in as much as games can be adapted. I think there's it very much, it captures very easily that feel of the game for obvious reasons. And I think game adaptations can become much riskier when they fall outside that animation base.
Well, I do believe the creative team responsible for Final Fantasy VII got the green light to do the Spirits Within based on their work in Final Fantasy VII in designing the cutscenes and designing the cinematics. They basically proved that they had the storytelling capability and vision to make that. And it's pretty impressive to have someone greenlight a big budget movie because of how impressive your video game is. I mean, that shows you the one-to-one relationship between the two pretty directly. How about on the flip side of movies and television being made into games? Now, this I think has a bit more mixed results and actually a couple of good products that have actually ended up being relatively playable and fun. The first ones that come to mind for me, I think, are those old Disney games that were for all those old consoles. I know they're for like the SNES, Sega. I think essentially every big Disney movie had one. Aladdin, The Lion King. I'm sure there's others that I'm blanking on, but those are the two I played the most. But those were actually, for the time, I think pretty great because they followed the storyline pretty directly, were challenging enough to make them interesting, but still playable for kids that were appropriate age to see those movies. They kind of just took the perfect route to making those.
I mean, many of them would be challenging for people our age. I remember The Lion King in particular was tough.
Yeah, the stampede level in The Lion King, and I spent some time on a tip line out of the Sega Genesis instruction booklet for Aladdin, trying to figure out how to escape the Cave of Wonders.
Justin, I think you're the only person in history that actually called a Sega Genesis tip line.
No, I called one for the game Gargoyles, and I think it was like $2.99 a minute, and the first like 6 minutes I was on hold that they still charged me for. So I think I paid like $40 to figure out like how to jump over a ledge in the Gargoyles game or something. But
well worth it.
yeah, that's neither here nor there.
It's here.
Any other examples you guys can think of adaptations into games? I mean, I've got a couple, but surprisingly, there are some pretty decent ones.
Yeah, I mean, we have a bunch of Lord of the Rings adaptations, some better than others. I remember playing a lot of the ones that followed the movies themselves, but then you have, Shadows of Mordor, some of the other PC games that are much more comprehensive and kind of delve deeper into the story and the lore of the world itself. You also have 24, The Matrix, those kinds of games that based on TV and movies, but it's pretty similar to what you experience in the plot of the movies themselves, but just kind of a separate storyline, just kind of taking the cool factor from each of those things, being Jack Bauer or being able to slow down time in the Matrix and just taking those cool elements and turning that into some gameplay.
Yeah, I mean, some things that come to mind for me, obviously South Park, which apparently South Park as a game very much did capture the experience of the show and did a pretty good job. Dragon Ball Z, Game of Thrones, Walking Dead. I mean, in fact, today it almost feels like everything can be pretty easily made into a game, or at least is being made into a game.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of Star Wars games. I know, Steve, you had played Knights of the Old Republic, and we're very much into that for some time.
Yeah, those Telltale games, specifically the Game of Thrones and Walking Dead series, are really interesting to me because I think and I haven't actually played them, but I've read quite a bit about them because I'm part of some fan communities for those two shows. I think what those games are in large part is almost like an approximation of a series of the television show that takes place with different characters, where the games aren't so much about gameplay as they are the player making decisions that changes the way this story unfolds for you, that almost feels like a separate season of the television show for you to enjoy.
Choose your own ending.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, exactly like that, which I think is a smart decision because, I mean, you could try to make, a generic action RPG or action adventure game out of Game of Thrones, or you could try to make a survival horror game out of The Walking Dead, but we've got a million of those already. I think if you really like those shows, at least for me, for certain, all I really want is more of a similar type of content, and a game that gives me that, but actually gives me the ability to sort of play into the storyline is a pretty cool idea, and something I think they'll continue to explore as more and more of these shows, get popular and keep growing.
Well said.
Thank you. I think this is a very kind of interesting time for us to be doing this episode specifically because I think 2016 is sort of a make or break year for the video game to screen adaptation process. Adapting these game series, these game properties into films. And it's very apt to talk about this right now because the movie Warcraft just came out, and we're all really big Warcraft fans. We talked earlier about how Warcraft led us into a Dota obsession. We will eventually talk about how Warcraft as a series by itself really influenced us and really made us big fans. But I don't think any of us have seen the Warcraft movie yet, which I think in part speaks to some of the reviews about it. But as a whole, it was sort of disheartening for me to hear a lot of the bad reviews that I expected about Warcraft, because seeing a really big budget, a really skilled creative team put behind a property like Warcraft was basically my dream. as a video game fan who also loves movies. Seeing these video game movies get made for years that stunk, a lot of that really wasn't that surprising because there was really no one of particular note behind the camera. There really wasn't that much support behind the movie. It was more a quick cash grab of, oh, some people like this game, so let's hurry up and rush and make the crappiest film we can and get it out to make a couple bucks. But this is Duncan Jones directing Warcraft, who did Source Code, he did Moon. He's a really skilled director, really big up-and-coming director. Surprising to see him take this project. So that was a movie that I really thought had a chance to break the mold of quote-unquote bad video game movies. But from all reviews, it's sort of fallen into the tropes of generic big-budget fantasy. There are some more promising reviews, and by all means, if and when, I want to say when because we probably will see the movie at some point, we'll share our own opinions. We don't want to just be blindly following the reviewers here, but most reviews kind of said it was just the cinematics and the effects and visuals were pretty impressive, but the acting was questionable, the writing was questionable, the plot was just hard to follow for people that had no idea what the Warcraft mythology was. There's just so many names and references to things that happened in the past of the series that, people just wouldn't be aware of. So it was sort of disappointing to hear that because with as much money was put into Warcraft and actually the upcoming Assassin's Creed movie as well, I just have a feeling that by the end of the year, they're really going to look at the success or failure of these two movies to determine how much studios want to spend going forward into big budget adaptations. I don't know if you guys have particular opinions about wanting to see Warcraft or the upcoming Assassin's Creed movie, but I think these are both pretty paramount.
I had a pretty strong opinion from the start when I had heard about both these developments that I expected Assassin's Creed would actually make a fantastic movie. I was very pessimistic about the way Warcraft would go. I think, like you, I will also end up seeing Warcraft at some point, but I'm not as excited about it. To be honest, when I loved Warcraft when I played it as a game, but I wasn't able to really envision it as a movie while I was playing it. There were certain very emotional moments, even involving Arthas, for example. But it was difficult for me to envision it as a movie. In my time that I've both watched and played Assassin's Creed, it was very easy for me to imagine it as a movie, and very easy for me even to imagine very epic choreographed cutscenes of assassinations. So so that's where I am.
I think they actually made a wise decision in deciding to go with the plot of the original Warcraft game for the movie because in a certain sense that's where it all starts and is a more simple plot line to follow on paper. But I was sort of disappointed to find out that, like every big budget movie now, they had to invent characters and invent storylines for the movie just to appease the average moviegoer. Apparently some people said that the character Paula Patton plays, who I believe is I could be incorrect, but I believe she's a human-orc hybrid or something, could be fine. I reserve judgment until we see the film. Maybe she's the best part of it, and I'll eat my words. But it just feels like the kind of thing where movies don't feel like the game storyline is strong enough on its own. They have to throw in these generic love interests. They have to throw in these generic side stories that are just typical of all big-budget movies, and they all just start feeling sort of similar because of that. They never really just trust the inherent storyline to be strong enough. They always need these sort of
these movie cliches. I completely agree with that, and that's something that actually frustrates me to no end. Like we don't get these cheesy ass side stories in many of the games that we play. Why do we have to throw them in a movie just because it's a movie?
Yeah, I mean, my first two words that came to mind when I saw the Warcraft movie was green avatar. I don't know if you guys would agree, but I feel like it was the orcs and everything just kind of reminded me of that, and just felt like a big budget James Cameron movie. I feel like there hasn't really been a good video game movie since Mortal Kombat, but I mean, I don't know if you guys agree with that.
The original or Annihilation, because I can assure you Annihilation's not good. But
well, I mean, they're both fantastic movies, just fantastic.
I do agree the original Mortal Kombat was very entertaining, and it holds up now in a sort of sheer watchability factor. It doesn't hold up in terms of the effects or the acting whatsoever, but it's still very fun in a campy way, and I'm just fine with that. Do you have any opinion, any exposure to Assassin's Creed, Justin, or any opinion about what you think that movie will do?
I mean, I think a lot of people will obviously see it just because of how big of a franchise title it simply is, and because it's something that's still, kind of developing. They've made new ones recently. I mean, Warcraft, we've kind of talked about how WoW has been out for quite some time. There hasn't been Warcraft 4 or anything like that. So a lot of the fan base from Warcraft, I would have expected would have fizzled at this point. But it seems like it's still making a decent amount of money. I heard like the first week in China, I mean, around like $90 million or something like that. So apparently a lot of people are seeing it.
Yeah, I think the international success of Warcraft is going to spawn a sequel regardless of how it does critically or in the US, just because if there's money in it, they will make it. And apparently the first movie sets up perfectly to segue into sequels, which, like I said, hopefully we'll watch it, we'll all enjoy it and want a sequel, but as of right now, it just sort of seems to be going exactly like I unfortunately expected. What does have me very pumped for Assassin's Creed, and I've actually never played the games, I'm well aware of them, but that creative team and that acting team is actually even more impressive than Warcraft. It's the guy Justin Kurzel directing it, who just directed the adaptation of Macbeth that looked visually absolutely insanely gorgeous, and particularly Michael Fassbender in the main role. You're talking about, in my opinion, one of the best actors of his generation who, for the most part, only does good work. He doesn't really take poor paycheck popcorn movies. The fact that he has some confidence in this story and this movie makes me think that it has a chance to actually be pretty sincerely and legitimately good. But again, we won't know until we see it.
Yeah, and I just want to add one element that I think makes Assassin's Creed particularly suitable to an adaptation. I think that plots which are a type of historical fiction, plots which essentially envision history as it is and then change it just a little bit, I think just are incredibly compelling as storytelling mediums and work even better on the big screen. And I think that's a huge advantage of Assassin's Creed. Just looking back into history as it was, and then envisioning this alternate timeline involving the Templars, but also even something like Metal Gear Solid, I could imagine being a fantastic movie as well.
Yeah, when there was a while there where I think every week I was reading up on Metal Gear Solid movie news, because once the property was bought up, I was so hopeful for a film being imminent. And actually, Christian Bale was asked to play the role of Solid Snake, and apparently played through all the games to get a better understanding of where the games are coming from. But as many movies do in that ilk, got put into development hell, and now at this point I'd be shocked if we ever got it. But that is the type of story that I think in the right hands could be pretty incredible. And I think that segues perfectly into something that'd be fun to sort of close on. Is I think it might be one of the hardest questions you could possibly ask someone when it comes to fandom of something. Tell me your favorite moment. But when we're thinking about some of the moments in games where the storytelling really shined, whether it be what was happening in the scene really stood out to you, or the way that the story actually unfolded, the creative means by which the story was told really stood out to you. What are some moments that spring to mind of just, it's not so much asking what was the most fun you ever had playing a video game, but what was a moment where a story in a game really stuck out in your mind because of the content of the scene or because of the actual storytelling device?
So I have a lot of moments, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them. First of all, one that's very recent. I think the opening to Fallout 4 is just fantastic, especially the moment as you're all running towards, before the apocalypse, you're all running towards the nuclear bunker, and as you are ushered onto a platform that is beginning to slowly descend into the bunker, you actually see a nuclear blast in the distance, and you experience the nuclear winds actually rush over top of the platform area as you're descending, and so you just barely make it, but it really communicates the backdrop of the story of Fallout and the grim beginning it's pretty extraordinary. Another thing that I loved, and this is a little bit of a different image, but Metal Gear Revengeance, actually, I think Metal Gear has a lot of fantastic moments, and I'm sure you'll speak to them, Kim. Metal Gear Revengeance is actually the one that I've played most recently, and as a game, of course, there's plenty of critiques, many things to be said about the way it diverges from the series, but nonetheless, one of the moments I loved is a particular boss fight with an enemy named Blade Wolf, who ultimately ends up becoming your companion, actually, in the game. But it's an extraordinary scene where Blade Wolf actually ambushes you with a chainsaw tail by essentially cutting you out of this elevated hallway. So you're falling and you have to defend yourself from this chainsaw, and then you have this conversation with his artificial intelligence, where you ask him the meaning of life, and you taunt him, and it's a very very compelling, actually, interaction between what a high-tech robot would be, and of course a more cynical assassin. But anyway, the fight itself is extraordinary. You actually have the Blade Wolf howling in the middle of the fight while also dashing at you, throwing knives at you, chainsaw. Incredibly just glorious moment. And then let's see, there's another moment I wanted to speak to. Oh, and this was interesting too. So this moment actually is, I would mark as one of the greatest letdowns in my gaming history. And as Justin mentioned earlier, I played through many of the Star Wars games, including more recently Star Wars: The Old Republic. So I'm not talking about Knights of the Old Republic, although that was a fantastic game as well, but Star Wars: The Old Republic. And unfortunately, I enjoyed many elements of this game, and unfortunately, in many ways, the game itself was a letdown. And part of the reason it was such a letdown was because the opening cinematic to the game was one of the most emotional, fantastic, best choreographed cutscenes I've ever seen in any game ever. Just truly fantastic and epic. And then you get to the game, and it's nothing really like the cutscene. I think that speaks a lot to just how much our experience of a game is really just shaped by that storytelling as a medium.
Yeah, those are all excellent examples. And for me, in my limited video game experience, I consider myself having a heart of stone, so it's hard to penetrate this guy. But I think for me, one of the greatest scenes is probably in Final Fantasy X. The scene with Titus and Yuna kind of in this bioluminescent body of water, and actually having a moment to kind of like embrace each other and be with each other in the moment when you have all this other destruction going on in the game. I mean, you have a lot of actually pretty breathtaking cutscenes throughout the game with, Titus falling through the cracks in the road, leaving Xanarkand and being sucked into this alternate universe, as it were. Seeing the Blitzball Stadium for the first time, all of those different things, but having kind of that moment of calm in all this destruction. And Final Fantasy loves to be very heart-wrenching as a whole, as I kind of just alluded to at the beginning of the episode with my pretty powerful Academy Award-winning reenactment of that scene with Aerith. And then I think some of the other ones, these aren't really powerful scenes in games per se, but just game trailers, I would say. Reaver of Souls for Diablo is actually pretty incredible scene cinematically, and just seeing actual souls get sucked and people get demolished is always an enjoyable sight for me.
I actually could probably spend an entire episode talking about favorite gaming trailers, just because of how pumped they can get me. Not to sidetrack us too much, but one that comes to mind, of course, Castlevania. Crap, which one is it?
One of the two Lords of Shadow trailers.
Yeah, it's the one where
Dracula goes out and turns into like a dragon, flies over the.
It's fucking awesome.
Yeah, that was for Lords of Shadow 2, I think. That was insane. Justin, I thought you were gonna say the Titus and Yuna laughing scene at first, and I was gonna start dying because I was gonna say that's probably the most mocked scene in the history of video games. But no, the scene you mentioned is actually really great. I think, I don't know if you can remember this. Is that the first time that Titus and Yuna interact once she realizes that she's gonna have to die after her pilgrimage?
I believe so, but it's been a while.
Yeah, no, I just remember that being a really great, really emotional scene. That's definitely one of my favorite parts of that game. I replayed it not too long ago, and I remember them sitting by that lakeside, then they go in the water, and yeah, just a terrific scene. I'll give two of mine real quickly because, like they both mentioned, I could name a million, but two that are pretty fresh in my mind. One's from the Phantom Pain, which I played pretty recently, which is, massive spoiler alert. Okay, 3, 2, 1, spoilers. When you find out later in the game that the character you're actually playing all along isn't Big Boss, isn't the snake you think it is, it's actually Venom Snake, who is the pilot from Ground Zeroes. All this stuff, once you find Paz back alive, back at Mother Base, that ends up turning out to be one elaborate sort of hallucination, really just blew my mind. It was a very, I kind of expected it to unfold the way it did, but the elegance of the storytelling in that part's really great. Just to quickly summarize, essentially there's this character you think is dead from the game that comes before the Phantom Pain, who all of a sudden you find alive on your base and you start interacting with. It ends up that all these interactions have just been basically this elaborate hallucination that your character's been having because of the guilt of letting this person die. So after all these interactions with this person, all these trippy, kind of crazy, dramatic sequences you have with her, it all ends up that he was essentially talking to no one and just reliving the guilt of her death, which I just felt was a very Kojima, very sort of poignant and really interesting way to display that. And the other one is from The Last of Us, which, in my opinion, I want to do an episode in The Last of Us at some point, maybe, if we've all played it at that point, but I would go out on a limb and say The Last of Us is the closest approximation to top-level filmmaking in terms of production values that I've ever found in a game. The voice acting is phenomenal. The storytelling is phenomenal. It's as emotional as any movie I've seen. It's just top to bottom, just absolutely great, and I think it speaks very highly of the future of video games and the type of level and quality you can expect from them. But there's a scene in that game after the pseudo-boss fight with this guy, David, when you're playing as Ellie, where essentially the main two characters have been split up for quite some time reconcile after this horrible moment. And just the beauty of that sequence of these two people embracing, the emotion is so real. The audio cuts out at a certain point, and you're just left to basically infer what they're saying to each other and what's going on just based on their reactions. And yet with that silent image, it conveys so much more than a subpar video game could in 500 lines of dialogue. It's really stuck with me long after that game. But as we all mentioned, being the fans we are, I think we could each sit here and wax poetic about quite a number of them. Anything else we want to mention about the drawbacks, the positives, and just the sort of beauty of storytelling in games as a whole? I think we sort of touched on the things we wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think Steve kind of encapsulated it earlier with talking about the range of traditional, more classic RPGs and then going into games that don't have storylines and everything like that. I think he kind of summarized everything pretty beautifully, so I feel like there's nothing else to have to say.
Yeah, I don't want anyone to get the idea that we're saying that if a game isn't first and foremost about its narrative, that it's bad. I mean, there's a million games that we all play where the storytelling is absolutely subservient to the gameplay, whatever else it might be. Multiplayer games that are first and foremost about having fun and being competitive rather than the story, and those can be incredible too. A game doesn't need to be narrative first in order to be a good video game, but if you're looking for compelling narratives in video games, they do exist, and I think they're only getting better with time.
I just wanted to add that I think, even many of the multiplayer games that we've all played together do have one compelling narrative to them, and that's really just Justin's consistent deaths. That Justin dies consistently and frequently, and I
always die a beautiful death.
And I think that ultimately is what has made so many multiplayer games so compelling to me. It's just Justin's frequent and continual failures.
Yeah, in a separate episode, we'll have to explore how Justin's death in gaming has evolved over time and how he's really branched out and opened up to new ways of surprising us with his ineptitudes.
It's really an art form. It truly is.
Well, on that note, why don't we do something we actually haven't done in quite some time, which I keep forgetting to do, which is let you know where to find us online if you care to look at some more Limit Breaker stuff in between episodes. I will go ahead and list our website, which is http, all that fun stuff, limitbreakers.libsyn, which is libsyn.com. Also, email us at thelimitbreakerspod@gmail.com. How about Facebook, Justin?
That would be facebook.com/thelimitbreakerspod, and you can give us some suggestions on games that you think we should play, give us some feedback on some of the episodes that we just recorded for you, and maybe submit some fan art or talk about some things that we didn't touch on in some of the episodes.
How about Twitter, Steve?
That'll be twitter.com/limitbreakerpod.
And as we have been mentioning, we don't yet have a dedicated YouTube URL. We're hoping to get one. We are now up to 24 subscribers. So each episode, we're slowly but surely climbing that ladder to 100. When we reach 100 subscribers, we will be doing a giveaway where we give away some gaming paraphernalia and games to our subscribers. And also a Q&A episode where we spend the whole episode answering your questions. So help us get there, please. It's been incredible, as always, to see that number slowly rise over time. We hope it keeps moving. Guys, it's been a really fun episode. I don't think it's too presumptuous to say that I think this one went a bit smoother than our last one even. Better, worse, the same?
I felt it was pretty solid, and I hope you guys enjoyed our first quote unquote lost episode, as it were.
Well, I suppose we won't actually know for sure until you get around to editing it, Cam. But it did seem relatively smooth to me.
Yeah, I mean, a third recording of this is not outside the question. Let's hope I don't press delete on anything this time. But with the assumption that that's not going to happen, guys, this has been episode 7 of the Limit Breakers podcast. We'll be back soon with some other stuff down the pipeline. I think we've got a Metal Gear episode coming up, possibly part 2 of Final Fantasy VII, possibly a Zelda episode, Warcraft episode. I mean, a lot of fun stuff coming down the pipeline. Look out for that. Thanks as always, guys, for Cameron.
Justin?
Steven.
We appreciate your listenership. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good one.